Ancient Babylonian records speak of someone in nobility called Lady Gaga and tells of her untimely death. Just before this, the pop star Lady Gaga releases a song called Babylon. Is this a Babylonian prophecy of the impending death of our beloved pop star, or is it merely a historical coincidence? It's a coincidence. It is definitely a coincidence. Hey, let's talk about Babylon. While Babylon looms quite large in the biblical consciousness, it's actually not often a very major player on the world stage. Throughout the majority of its history, Babylon's actually kind of just a small city-state without a ton of power. But there are two periods within Babylonian history that it rises up and becomes an empire. These empires are incredibly short-lived and tend to just be connected to very competent leadership. In fact, the surrounding kingdoms kind of used to pick on Babylon a little bit as kind of the weak kid in the class. Their Assyrians were always sort of jumping over Babylonian walls and stealing their god Marduk and running back to Assyria with it. Just kind of to tick off the Babylonians. You know what the Assyrians are like, let me tell you. The first Babylonian empire was under the great king Hammurabi, starting in around 1894 and going to about 1595 BC. The Babylonians create their first empire. They invade the floundering Sumerian empire and take it over with relative ease and become the dominant political player in Mesopotamia at this time. A lot of their success can be attributed to the incredibly wise king Hammurabi. Hammurabi loved taking over new territories and conquering new people. He had actually a really clever tactic when he wanted to invade a new place. He would surround the city and then he would dam off the water that went into the city. There he would either do two things. One, he would cut off all the water from the city so that the people would be dehydrated and just come out and surrender rather than dehydrate to death. Or he'd allow the dam to build up and build up and build up until absolutely it was swelling with pressure, and then he would flood out a city, also causing the people to surrender. But what Hammurabi was most famous for was his law code. Hammurabi's law code was possibly the first codified law code to exist in all of human history. We actually see that Hammurabi's law code has a huge influence on the Mosaic code. Terms like eye for an eye come from Hammurabi's law code. Yet Hammurabi's law code was really not the same as the biblical law code. The important distinction in Hammurabi's law code was that there was three classifications of people. Highest were landowners, then we have freedmen, and finally we have slaves. And built into this law code was that laws applied more heavily to some than to others. For example, if a landowner stole somebody's chicken, they may have to pay a fine, whereas if a slave sold a chicken, the slave could be executed. Women did not enjoy much protection under Hammurabi's law code and could be drowned to death by the mere accusation of infidelity or impropriety. In this beautiful recording of Hammurabi's law code, we actually see Hammurabi being given the law code by the Babylonian god Shamash, the god of justice. This was a firm belief in the world at that time. The only way one could have the capacity to rule was if they were given that capacity by the gods themselves. For only the gods had the knowledge of good and evil, and only people who received that knowledge from the gods had the right to rule. The next section of the Babylonian Empire was Nebuchadnezzar II's empire. This incredibly short-lived empire was down to the dynamic leadership of Nebuchadnezzar. This empire lasts from about 626 to 539 BC. The empire begins with a very famous battle of Carchemish. Babylon and a few allies faces the might of the great Egyptian and Assyrian empire. And although it was a battle the Egyptians were expected to absolutely wipe out the Babylonians, somehow the Babylonians come forth victorious. They destroy the combined might of Egypt and Assyria with such ferocity that Assyria kind of fades away as an empire, and Egypt is no longer ever a major player in the world stage. This battle has such a huge effect on the world around it, it is even spoken of within the Bible.
Who is this that rises like the Nile, like rivers of surging water? Egypt rises like the Nile, like rivers of surging water. She says, I will rise and cover the earth. I will destroy cities and their people.
After this battle, there is such unyielding admiration for Nebuchadnezzar that people recognize him as the new great power in the region. Babylonian mythology tells us that the city of Babylon was first built by the god Marduk. Marduk builds a city out of mud and reeds, and it becomes a great empire. Pulling reeds from the clay that was watered by the mighty Euphrates, the people of Babylon had an abundant resource of reeds and clay that enabled them to build their mighty empire, just as the Sumerians had done before them. The Babylonian Empire is both glorious and terrible. During the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, he invested in huge building projects which made Babylon possibly the most glorious city on the earth. 2 to 3 of the great wonders of the ancient world were to be found in this one city of Babylon. You've possibly heard of the great Hanging Gardens of Babylon. History tells us this was built because one of Nebuchadnezzar's wives missed the luscious forests of her home, and Nebuchadnezzar decided to build her a place that would remind her of the greenery of her homelands. Although recent studies tell us that this garden probably did not exist within Babylon itself. More likely, after Babylon had destroyed Assyria and Nineveh, they probably built the Hanging Gardens in Nineveh, as they thought this was now part of the Babylonian Empire. Among the most famous monuments within Babylonian city were the great gates of Ishtar, beautifully decorated with these wonderful images of animals that represented the great gods of Babylon, striking in this powerful blue color that just seems to shine out in the deserts. And after you pass through these gates was a famous walkway called "May the Arrogant Not Flourish" walkway. And oddly enough, at the end of that walkway was a ziggurat. Kinda weird, go figure, but there you are. Babylon was surrounded by mighty walls that were as long as 50 miles long, and historians said that the walls themselves were so thick that a chariot could ride upon the top of them. But like most walls throughout human history, they actually don't work particularly well, and they were frequently being destroyed just for fun, and people had to repair them all the time. But it was also a city of great carnal pleasure. It boasted the world's most incredible foods that were available, new forms of entertainment that the world had never seen, and lots of sex services come up through the city of Babylon. Like the world around them at this time, the Babylonian world was a polytheistic world. The most powerful and popular deity was Marduk, the god of storms and wind, who legendarily defeated the great dragon Tiamat in the creation of the world. This famous story was recorded in that great Babylonian epic, the Enuma Elish. Another famous Babylonian divinity was Ishtar. Also not where we get the word Easter, like ever, okay? Ishtar was like the goddess Aphrodite if she really liked to murder people. Ishtar loved good old stories about violence and blood, and particularly stories about sex. The Babylonians famously declared that Ishtar was as delighted as much by sex as by blood. In the worship of Ishtar, one could buy for themselves love potions or a cure for erectile dysfunction.
Viva Ishtar!
When Herodotus first arrives in Babylon, he noted that the pretty girls were actually sold at auction, and the parents would collect the money for the pretty girls that they had sold, and then use that funds to kind of sell off the less attractive daughters that they had, so kind of everybody got a fair go. Herodotus thought this was great. Kind of like an early sort of communist Tinder vibe. Also, according to Herodotus, all Babylonian women had to present themselves at the temple in order to hand themselves over for temple prostitution. All Babylonian women would have to go to their temple, and a man could pay to have sex with any one of these women. This was something all women had to do at a point in their life. The Babylonians were really obsessed with signs in the world around them. In the Babylonian omen text, it tells the people how they could read signs of what was going to happen to them. Things like killing a rabbit or a fish and then opening it up and looking if there's spots on the liver to determine if, it was a good omen for a battle or this king would succeed, and all these different things. If a child was born with a certain deformation, it was a sign of good omens or bad omens and different things like that. The Babylonians loved astronomy. They believed that the gods had written great signs within the stars that was their job to interpret them and read them and figure out what they were supposed to do. And they had a really interesting practice that if there was a bad omen, they really felt they had to protect the king. So they would take the king off the throne and kind of put him in a bunker out of the way for a couple of months. And then they would get a commoner off the streets and ask this commoner, "Hey dude, do you want to pretend to be king for a couple of months? Because we had kind of a bad omen and we really want to protect the king, so we're going to take him out of the way, and if you want, you can sit in the king's throne, eat all his food, sleep in his bed, have a great couple of months, but if anything bad's gonna happen, we want it to happen to you. What, I get to be king for 3 months? No way! Woo! Sweet deal! I'm gonna take that gig! And if anything bad happened to the commoner while they were king, they just saw it that was the punishment meant for the king, but came to a different person. And if the time passed and the commoner was absolutely fine, the Babylonians killed the commoner anyway, just to make sure that the punishment was properly seen through and the king would be fine. Take from that what you will. But we see from this something very distinct from the biblical understanding. In the biblical understanding, catastrophes don't come about because signs in the heavens or weird spots on a fish's liver. Catastrophes come about because of immoral behavior. If a king was sinning and committing evil in the eyes of the Lord, then catastrophe came about. This goes back to that distinct ethical monotheism that was completely unique in the world at that time. The Babylonians are pretty major players in biblical history. We note in Genesis 4, the Chaldeans, who were also the Babylonians, were responsible for kidnapping Abraham's nephew Lot. The Tower of Babel was likely a Babylonian ziggurat. That was a process that the Babylonians had adopted from the Sumerians. Possibly the most famous Babylonian story to interact with the biblical connection was the Enuma Elish. The Enuma Elish was kind of the book of Genesis for Babylon. It was how the world and universe came into being and how Marduk became the greatest god. The connections between the two is so intense that today most scholars would say one has to influence the other. In all likelihood, the book of Genesis was influenced by the Enuma Elish. It is likely that the author of the book of Genesis is almost directly contradicting the Babylonian creation account, taking elements by what they believed about the creation of the world and noting how the God of Scripture was even greater. Let's compare the creation accounts in the Enuma Elish and the Book of Genesis to see how the authors interacted with each other theologically. The Enuma Elish is written on 7 tablets. In the Book of Genesis, there are 7 days of creation. In the Enuma Elish, the earth and sky are not named. Naming something is giving it purpose and bringing order to something that was chaotic. In Genesis, the earth is formless and void, almost in an uncreated state. In the Enuma Elish, Apsu and Tiamat, who were goddesses of disorder, come together and mingle their waters together. Tiamat was a goddess of the sea, so she would have had salty waters. In the world of this time, you were dependent on the waters rising and ebbing in just the right way so as they would water your crops appropriately. If the water is too low, your crops aren't going to get any water and you may starve. If they go too high, they'll wipe out all your crops and you will starve. So the order of the waters was fundamentally a religious concept upon which people lived and died. Uniquely, God separates the waters, creating dry land and creating order in this chaos. In the Enuma Elish, it says no other gods had been called into being at this time, meaning it was gods that come out of nature, not nature coming out of God. In the beginning, God creates the heaven and the earth. In the biblical account, nature comes from God, not God from nature. The great god of order, Marduk, clashes with Tiamat in a battle for the ages. Tiamat, the great goddess of salt water, is portrayed as a dragon that can destroy all of society. And just as she's about to eat up Marduk, who's the god of the winds, blows all of the ill-fated winds into the dragon's mighty mouth, exposing her organs, allowing Marduk to fire an arrow directly into her vital organs, killing her dead. There is a mighty clash that happens over the god of salt water and the god of wind over the waters. Genesis, by contrast, the spirit of God just sort of hovers over the water. He just kind of chill. He just kind of, floating in the waters, enjoying himself, just having a good time. And this word spirit is the Hebrew word ruach, which is the same word for wind. In the Babylonian account, where the god of wind and the goddess of salt water are clashing together and there's a fierce and violent war, in the biblical account, the god of the Hebrews is just hovering, just kind of chilling on the water. This is how powerful he is. Then Marduk takes the body of Tiamat, rips it in two, and uses half of it to create the sky. In the biblical account, God says, "Let there be water under the sky." God doesn't have to go to war or rip people apart in order to be considered king. He just speaks his reality into existence. This is the power of the God of Scripture. The biblical account almost presents a direct challenge to the Babylonian account of creation. It almost attacks the Babylonian theology by point by point, highlighting the greatness of the God of Israel. The next area of impact is where the Second Babylonian Empire actually destroys Judah. Okay, pay attention, because this history is kind of complicated. The first king to whom we have to be introduced is Jehoiakim. Jehoiakim is considered one of the nasty pagan rulers of Judah. Now, in the world at this time, smaller nations would pay a tribute to larger nations in order that those larger nations wouldn't come in and destroy them. And those larger nations promised not to destroy them and also defend them if another bigger nation tried to attack them. So Jehoiakim is paying a tribute to Egypt at this time, so Egypt would protect them and not destroy them. But after the Battle of Carchemish, Egypt is totally wiped out by Babylon, so quickly Jehoiakim switches sides, writes a quick letter to Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon saying, "Hey dude, I totally think you're cool, definitely like the best king, so how about, I never really liked those Egyptians anyway, I was just pretending, but I've been rooting for you this entire time. You the man, baby. Hey, do you want some stuff? Do you want some gold? I'll send it to you. It's gonna be really cool. How about a couple of people too? Oh, I've got this one guy called Daniel, super smart. Hey, I'll send him to you. You're gonna like him." But then Nebuchadnezzar actually tries to invade Egypt again, but this time Nebuchadnezzar the Babylonian is defeated by the Egyptians. Well, if the poop didn't hit the fan, it was already in. Then Jehoiakim writes to the Egyptians. Oh my god, okay, don't pay attention to that stuff I wrote to Nebuchadnezzar earlier. Totally, I was just kidding. I was kind of like, I was just seeing what he was up to, get a feel for him. Then I was going to report back to you guys and tell you how awesome you were and how I was hoping you were going to win the whole time. Hey, here's some stuff, here's some tribute, because I think you guys are cool. So then when Jehoiakim sides with Egypt, the Babylonians get super ticked off, and Nebuchadnezzar invades Judah for the first time and brings terrible destruction on the people. In Nebuchadnezzar's first invasion of Judah, he actually kills Jehoiakim. And then, after the death of Jehoiakim, you have Jeconiah, who was his son, becoming king of Israel. Then Nebuchadnezzar's kind of ticked off about this because he is worried that Jeconiah is going to want to avenge his father upon Nebuchadnezzar. And then Nebuchadnezzar kidnaps Jeconiah, brings him to Babylon, and actually sets him up in kind of a nice little house, nice little palace, and gives him a ton of food and clothes and stuff, and he has a very nice life. Interestingly enough, the archaeologists have discovered the ration tablets of Jeconiah, which tell us what kind of food and all the great stuff that Jeconiah was given by Nebuchadnezzar to keep him happy and comfortable within the palace. This was actually quite common practice at that time for the larger country to kidnap one of the family members of the smaller country, just kind of as a little bit of a safety thing. Hey, we're looking after your nephew over here, and we're going to be really, really nice to him and hook him up, and he's going to live a very comfortable life as long as you behave. Any messing from you, you remember that we've got your boy, and if we need to teach you a lesson, we're going to teach you a lesson one finger at a time. Oh, this is getting complicated. And then, after Jeconiah is kidnapped, we see his uncle Zedekiah take over. Nebuchadnezzar himself actually chooses Zedekiah because he thinks he's going to be a lot more loyal to him than any of his predecessors were. Interestingly enough, archaeologists have actually discovered court records from the court of Nebuchadnezzar, which retells this story in detail. So initially, Zedekiah is being a very good boy, he's being a very good vassal state, he's sending his taxes to Nebuchadnezzar, and everything looks like it's going to be fine. But for some crazy reason, Zedekiah pulls that old trick. Egypt, I know I was kind of messing around with Nebuchadnezzar before, but dude, don't even worry about that. That's totally done now. You guys are the cool guys. You are the ones we definitely want to hang out with. So how about we join up together? We'll be buddies. I'm gonna send you guys some money and we'll come together. Dude, we gonna kick Nebuchadnezzar's butt with my boys, my Egyptian boys. We go back a long way, you guys. And then Nebuchadnezzar has finally had enough. Nebuchadnezzar comes in and absolutely destroys the people of Judah and Jerusalem. Zedekiah is forced to watch his children be murdered and then his eyes pulled out so that the last vision he would ever see would be the dead body of his sons. Then, wrapped in chains, he is forced to march to Babylon. It is recorded in 2 Kings 25, the destruction of the people of Judah and their way of life.
He set fire to the temple of the Lord, the royal palace and all the houses of Jerusalem. Every important building he burned down.
As Nebuchadnezzar comes forward, he completely surrounds the city of Jerusalem and stays there for a year and a half. No food can go in or out of the city. Archaeologists have discovered toilets from Jerusalem at this time, and they have analyzed the feces that was found within these toilets. Within the analysis, there was a tremendous amount of parasites. There was also fish bones and barely edible weeds. There were no traces of bread, grains, or meat. This shows at the time that people were starving, so much so they were resorting to eating inedible fish bones and weeds out in the street that probably didn't provide them much nourishment. Archaeologists have also discovered a layer of destruction called the Babylonian layer of destruction. This layer is absolutely thickly riched with Babylonian arrowheads. This shows that the absolute gargantuan number of arrows that were fired upon the people of Judah absolutely beggared imagination. The destruction of Jerusalem was powerful, it was complete, and it was absolute. So much so, the very Temple of Solomon itself was burnt to the ground. Anything of even the slightest value was taken out of the land of Judah. This included people with even a smattering of education or skill, where they're all brought to Babylon to work for the Babylonian kingdom. People such as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego would have been included in this group. This destruction represents an end of an era of stability for God's people. Throughout both the Old and New Testament, Babylon is a catch-all term used to describe societal rottenness. In the book of Revelation, the city of Babylon is seen as sort of the great evil in the world, probably representing the Roman Empire. Even today, certain religious groups will use the term Babylon to describe people they don't like. The Reformers constantly refer to the Catholic Church as Babylon, whereas groups like Rastafarians today see Babylon as a representative of colonialism and oppression and economic inequality. The Jehovah's Witnesses famously call anything that isn't Jehovah's Witness part of Babylon. Shortly after the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Babylon itself does start to fall into ruin. Under the reign of Nebuchadnezzar's son, Babylon is eventually no more and conquered by the Persians. Babylon boasted that its greatness was founded in being built by mud and reeds. Yet it's the very fact that it's built by mud and reeds means it eventually crumbles and melts over time until it's just nothing but a shapeless mound, reminiscent of the great prophecy by Jeremiah.
Babylon will be a heap of ruins, a haunt for jackals, an object of horror and scorn, a place where no one lives.
And thus forth, Babylon the Great has fallen.